SECfans.com preview show for week 1 coming up. A few big games in the SEC and a whole bunch of other crap. So we're going to have to talk about a few other things besides Alabama, Florida State, Georgia Tech, and Tennessee, A&M and UCLA. We're going to talk about the rankings in our minds in terms of who we think is the best to worst in each division in the SEC, as well as get to those games that I mentioned. But first, before we get to the games, Husky, this is an interesting concept that we can talk about right now because everything is still in theory coming out of the summer. You and I, since we're stats-driven, really prefer something that allows us to put a computer model to it. But since we're kind of playing with just sort of our gut right now, let's talk about how you would rank and how I would rank the SEC coming out of the summer, coming out of fall camp, and getting ready to start this season. And what I want to put it to you, we'll start with the East. I wanted to put it to you in terms of not how the pollsters rank people, because I'm not going to jump into a rant this early, but the pollsters rank people based on how easy their schedule is and where they think they're going to end up because they don't have that many losses on their schedule. What I want you to do for me, in your opinion, is rank the East, and then we'll get to the West, in terms of how good the teams are. So if they were playing a mid-level team on any given field, how would they all fare relative to one another, not necessarily who has the easiest schedule and best chance to win the East. Do you got me?
I've got you.
Okay.
So, in the East, I think, we've already talked about this in our earlier episodes, but I think a big part of what's going to happen in the SEC this year is that the East has a lot of turnover, particularly defensively, and some of the units are a little more stout. And we're starting to see development, I think, at the quarterback position from what was kind of a weird topsy-turvy year. Saw a bizarre number of signal callers, as we talked about all stinking year last year, that would run the ball more than they would throw it, and often run the ball more than the running backs did.
Right.
And now we're starting to move kind of past that phase, if you will, and getting out of adolescence into the maturity of traditional gentrified drop-back quarterbacks. But, as that happens, I think one of the major issues throughout the conference really is the lack of returning production at receiver. A lot's being said about Florida, and the fact that they have a pretty good receiving core. I know Callaway got suspended, but that's probably a temporary setback. But for the most part, they do return most of their returning receiver production. However, some other schools do not. So, kind of as a high level, I wanted to touch on all that because I think it's, if it's not the most controlling thing in the Eastern Division, I think it's going to be close to it. And, everybody looks at quarterbacks and people look at receivers. But I think, just as an early sort of statement, if you want to know the way that the East is going to go, in my opinion, you need to look at who returns what at the receiver position. So, okay, all that said, right? Who goes where? Well, I think personally, the most likely team to be successful, if you want my number one team in the East, it's probably still Florida.
Wow.
Now, again, we have this whole discussion previously about who's going to be the quarterback. I don't know who it will be, but I do know that it probably can't be worse than it was last year and when they won the division. But whoever is the quarterback, they have what is mostly a returning offensive line. They have returning starting running back. They have returning starting receivers, the guys that are moving into the lineup, like Tyree Cleveland is a very talented guy. So I think offensively, they should be a fair amount better. Now, they lose a ton of production defensively. So this is a huge question mark. Depending on package, maybe as few as 2 players may return that were started last year. But that was also a defensive unit that got a lot of banged up over the course of the year last season. And so a lot of these guys have played a lot of snaps. And not only did they play a lot of snaps, but they played meaningful snaps. CeCe Jefferson is going to move into a starting role, probably a high caliber player. You still have Marcel Harris and Duke Dawson. So I don't think the defense will be bad by any means. And, you contrast that to the other major player in the East and I think the trendy pick for a lot of people, and that would be Georgia. And Georgia in many ways is the opposite. Georgia, returns a lot of receivers, but they still lose Isaiah McKenzie. And
They didn't have any
they
receivers to begin with.
exactly in our preview last year, one of the things I pointed out was, I thought in a lot of ways Georgia could be good or better than they were the year prior. But my number one point was, that's great, fine, and wonderful, but who's going to catch the football? When they lost their number one, they had a dominant number one target in the year prior. And so when they lost him and they kind of relied on McKenzie, it sort of worked, but at the same time, they weren't quite the same team that they had been, when they did have that, that receiver production in 2015. And, you know, I, I don't know. I just don't think they ever really replaced Malcolm Mitchell. And Terry Godwin is a good receiver in his own right, and I understand that. But Isaiah McKenzie was not the right build for it. And I don't really see that getting fixed this year. Riley Ridley is a fair receiver, was a fairly highly touted guy. But, let's be completely honest. Ridley, to a large degree, I think, is at Georgia because he knew he would crack that depth chart immediately. And I know I'm harping on all that a lot, but when you also look at it, what has been the prototypical Achilles heel for Georgia, and that's the offensive line. You lose 3 out of 5 starters in the offensive line. You have a quarterback in Eason that's a little inconsistent, and there's, I think, way too much credit being given to the running backs when all the other pieces, the skill position pieces on an offense that wasn't particularly good last year, generally don't come back. And
Yeah, that's a good point. Before you go on with Georgia, I'm glad you touched on that because everybody is high on Georgia. I think largely because they have a big armed, big named quarterback who, as you said in our quarterback review, kind of regressed as the season went on last year. But also, they've got a lot of talent at tailback, especially Nick Chubb. But we saw towards the end of the season last year, teams were really able to bottle him up when they saw that there was not going to be any production in the passing game. So you couple that with the fact that they've lost 3 starters on offense, and there's probably some offensive line. There's probably some concerns like you have for Georgia, but I wonder, because we talked about this a lot last year for Georgia, and I'd like for you to touch on it before you get any further into the East. I wonder if the fact that they returned 10 starters on defense, only losing Maurice Smith, a defense that we saw carrying that team a lot last year, was actually a pretty good unit. I thought undervalued in the SEC. Is that enough to maybe make up for what you rightly see as glaring deficiencies on the offensive side?
I think it may be. The interesting thing to me with these two teams is, to some degree, I could see Florida and Georgia reversing course from last year. Georgia defensively returns a ton of guys. They were a very good defense last year. And, there's every bit of potential for these guys to be a really top-notch, borderline phenomenal unit that, really cracks down. The problem to me, to some degree, is defensively, Georgia was not dominant last year like I thought they might be. End the season, give up 28 to Georgia Tech in a loss. They gave up 23 to TCU, which wasn't so bad. But TCU, as we talked about earlier last year in the Arkansas game, just really was not a very good team last year. 21 to Louisiana, 24 to Kentucky, 24 to Florida. I mean, point being here that they really, they didn't really stop many of the great teams. The first half of the year, got blown out by Ole Miss and then lost in the Hail Mary game to Tennessee. I think they're going to be good, but I don't think it's quite what Florida was last year, where it was an elite defense the year prior that returned almost everybody, and at times, when healthy last year, could just about blank a lot of teams. When healthy and focused, I guess I should say. But, I think Georgia could win some really low scoring affairs. I see a lot of games though, just kind of going like I'm not saying they're necessarily going to lose them, but like the painful game the Vanderbilt Georgia game was last year.
Right.
They don't have Isaiah McKenzie to bafflingly give him the ball and run him right at Cunningham anymore. But I think there's going to be a lot more low scoring games. and that's good and bad. But as we've talked about a lot, when you have a low scoring game, what that tends to mean is luck comes into play more because one one tip pass touchdown or one fumble that's recovered one way or the other easily can turn the tide of the game because it's just a matter of one touchdown and one field goal deciding it. So I never like to pick teams too high that are struggling offensively and very good defensively. Those teams can beat anyone, but they also can and will lose to anyone, and that's kind of where I stand with the University of Georgia this year.
So you mentioned them second. Does that mean you have them second in order of best to worst, or were you just kind of segueing into them and you got somebody else in that second slot?
No, that I mean they are who I have second. I am still fairly high on Georgia, at least in theory, just surely due to the fact that they have a ton of talent. Offensively, you think they should be all right. Defensively, they still should be pretty good. The East is not necessarily, a brutal place to live in the college football world, so I think they can still make things work pretty well. Now, here in the three spot, I kind of debated back and forth who I'd go with next, but somewhere in three or four here, and I think I'm going to put it. I won't call it shock value, but there's kind of a multi-way tie in my mind. This is my most surprising pick. I think the Missouri Tigers could be radically better than they're anticipated being this year.
I'm not surprised you said that because you were real high on Drew Lock when we talked about the quarterbacks for the returning teams or teams that had returning quarterbacks this year, and then looking at their schedule last year and seeing how they were able to score a lot of points. They really struggled defensively, but based on your tone and how much you seem to like Drew Lock, I thought you might have them higher than expected, and I think a lot of people are going to be counting them out based on solely their win-loss total last year, and I could see where you and I might disagree on like the Auburn game in week 4 or 5 where, Missouri, you said Missouri might snap up and beat them. Even if they didn't beat an Auburn or somebody like that early, I could see them being in a game that you wouldn't think they'd be in, simply partially because they're overlooked and partially because I think they've got one of the best quarterbacks in the conference.
Yeah, I agree. And I should really be clear. I think the rest of the East is a virtual crapshoot. For the most part, I just don't think the East is very clear outside those first two teams. So it's kind of a little bit on theory, but Missouri, for all the heat they took defensively, offensively, they were extremely good last year. One of the best teams in the conference, week in, week out. And I don't think that's given, frankly, near enough credit for what they were able to do in 2016. I mean, led the conference in yards per game. They were fifth in the conference in yards per play. And I can't see that regressing. They bring back every one of their starting receivers, bring back most of their offensive line, including both tackles, bring back their quarterback. And then this is really the big key to me. And this is, I think, where a lot of times people miss things going into preseasons. I like to when I look at defenses or offenses, but particularly defenses, for me to see a defense improve, my question is, were they good last year? If the answer is yes, and they return a lot of guys, great. If the answer is no, I want to see two things from a defense. I want to see one, that you recruited talent, and that's not necessarily the case, unfortunately, in Missouri here. But the second thing I want to see is, have starters been replaced by backups from the year prior, and or are you pulling in players that weren't available from the year prior? Missouri checks both those boxes. There's a chance that two guys that started at safety last year will not start this year. There are multiple junior college players that are going to be in the lineup this year, and some of those junior college players kind of had a reputation over the spring for being borderline unblockable. Now, I'm not saying that that they will be unblockable or that they're necessarily going to be all world, but when you consider the case in the East and the fact that I don't think anybody really is uh necessarily perfect, then guys like Nate Howard coming in, I think can make a pretty big impact. And you've got, a new nickel back that's a Kansas State transfer. You got a sophomore coming in, starting at corner more than likely, that didn't play last year. You have a defensive tackle that is coming back from a knee injury. You have another defensive tackle that was a junior college transfer. So, that's a lot of pieces that weren't bad pieces last year that I'm magically expecting better. They're just pieces that didn't exist last year on what was probably the best offense in the East. So when you take those two things together, given the state of the division, and the fact that Missouri kind of has a history of it, I could see Missouri being a huge spoiler in the conference. Now, as I said, it's a bit of a tie, and I'll kind of run down the rest of the list. After Missouri, I I think, personally, I'm probably going to go with Tennessee next. We've already talked about the fact that, I'm not going to rehash the whole quarterback discussion. We're both pretty high on Dormady. He has a lot of potential, and I'm going to give Tennessee kind of a question mark here. There's a lot of talent on that roster. You got guys like Trey Smith, who's a true freshman that's a very high level player. Still got Juwan Jennings. John Kelly's a solid running back. I think Dormady has the chance to be a pretty solid passer. And then defensively, you've got, there's a lot of talent on that roster. Kongbo, McKenzie, still have Vickers, Shaq Wiggins. I mean, those guys are all pretty high level players. I am definitely concerned by the fact that not only did they lose more players than they kept, but when they had a lot of injuries last year, they were particularly bad. That gives me a lot of pause. That's why I have Tennessee all the way down here at fourth in the quote rest of the pack. If people are wondering about that, it's just because if I see a team that has a ton of injuries and they take a huge step back, that's a massive red flag to me. Florida last year had a lot of injuries defensively, still pretty competent. Tennessee had a lot of injuries defensively. They became a sieve. So that, there's no reason for me to think that those guys that were the backups last year that stepped in early are going to suddenly be all world this year when they're starters. Um, that's where Tennessee is. I think the next slot, I personally want to give the edge probably to South Carolina. There are some parts of their team that I think are just straight deficient. The players they've had somewhat on the lines. I think the offensive line was okay, but the defensive line was not very good. But particularly cornerback, the corners they've been fielding. We've talked about this for about 2 years. It's borderline inexcusable, frankly. What Spurrier left Muschamp with at South Carolina, and it's going to take some time to fix. And we talked about that last year in our preview that South Carolina is going to take a few years to get back to where they need to be, and there's going to be a lot of patience that really is required for them to recover. But I do think Bentley has a tremendous amount of upside. They still returning a ton of production at receiver and running back positions. And I think Muschamp has a very good track record, frankly, of making defenses competent. Kentucky returns a ton of starters. I think Steven Johnson was a pretty good quarterback. My problem with them is I think Johnson's somewhat at his ceiling. I think they're going to miss the running backs, production they had last year with Boone Williams pretty badly at times because he was such a good back for them. The offense also was not that dominant, one, and two, it's the opposite of the Missouri problem. Kentucky does return 8 defensive starters, but they return 8 defensive starters for a unit that at times just got flat run over, frankly, last year. And these guys are not going to get magically bigger and stronger to a certain extent. They may get more sound, but they basically got blown off the ball last year, and I don't really expect that will change this year. And that's why I have Kentucky low. Finally, with no surprise, the last team would be Vanderbilt Commodores. We've talked about this quite a bit. I do not personally believe that Shermer is the redeeming quarterback that he's made out to be. And I don't mean to try to be mean with that, but Shermer was dead last in the conference in yards per attempt last year. Um, Dead last in the conference in QB rating. I know he kind of turned it around at the end of the season with that big win over Tennessee, but again, that was a Tennessee team that was imploding, and the week before, an Ole Miss team that was imploding. The rest of the season, he was not very effective, and in the bowl game against North Carolina State, he was dismal. So I think there was a little bit of a flash in the pan against two particularly bad defenses. And I think you have to look at the Auburn game, Missouri game, and North Carolina State game that bracket it and say that what probably was a bit of an aberration. And then when you look at them beyond that, They're kind of getting out of the Franklin years. I don't see a ton of talent on this roster, frankly, at all. Ralph Webb is a good player, but outside of that, you just don't lose the sort of, you don't lose a Cunningham if you're Vanderbilt and get better defensively. It just doesn't happen.
So what does that say about Derek Mason? I know there was a lot of excitement when he came into town, and I was one of those people who really thought that certainly there would be a step back after Franklin, because Franklin really did something special there at Vanderbilt. But I thought he could maybe mitigate the damage that would happen, in that transition, because like you said, you can't lose personnel on the field and replace them at Vanderbilt, and then you couple that, I've used couple twice in this call, you couple that with the fact that they're losing a coach of that caliber. I feel like it was too much for them to overcome. But does this mean something bad about Mason, or does this mean Mason's at a bad school?
It's a bit of both. I watched several games by Vanderbilt the past couple of years where I just didn't feel like Mason really had a good grasp of what was going on. At times, I felt like they were overly conservative, or at times, I felt like they were overly aggressive. I think it's a lot better this year, but the year prior, there were times where I felt like they just had no idea what they were doing, frankly. And I understand the quarterback situation was very good, but they were just lost. And I think now that Mason's being more involved with the defense and leaving the offense on its own, it's paid dividends. And I hate to say this, but to some extent, I think it may be just not meddling with the offense as much. And I think it was unfair to expect anybody to replace Franklin, because he was a very good coach in what is a very tough situation at Vanderbilt. They just don't have the resources other schools do. It's not just about the academic credentials; it's about the facilities. It's about the stadium, the experience student athletes get. You can't recruit at the same level, and it's so much lower that unless you have somebody like Franklin that can really sell your program, it's just not going to be even remotely close. So,
And you're
you know,
competing with Stanford and, frankly, Northwestern, both of which have done better on the football field in recent years. So that makes it tough too.
yeah, no, I agree. So, I mean, you wrap all that up, and I don't know. I just don't see really how anybody could be that successful in this situation. But with that said, I think I don't think Mason's really the man for the job. I think he's a little in over his head. I don't think he's addressed things the way he needs to. You cannot be a conservative football coach and play conservative football at Vanderbilt and be overly successful. One, and two, if you do that, you need to be an extremely fundamentally sound team on both sides of the ball. And I have not seen that from them the past 2 years. And that's kind of where I stand with Vanderbilt.
All right, so you had Georgia, Florida, Missouri, and then did you go Tennessee?
Yeah, I went Tennessee next. Um,
South
then after
Carolina,
Tennessee, yep, South Carolina, and after South Carolina,
Kentucky.
Kentucky, yep, Vanderbilt, and that's the way I see it panning out, and it's not unlike previous years. The East is kind of a mishmash. And I don't know that there's any clear definition. I think Florida and Georgia both have a lot of potential, and they both have a lot of flaws. And given that everybody's so flawed, the one team I see that actually has some pieces that I could see clicking is Missouri, which is why I have them where they are. But nobody else in the division is really close to Florida or Georgia when it comes to pure talent.
So for me, I would switch your Georgia and Florida, mainly because I feel like if I'm putting my money on defense or offense being consistent enough to win throughout the season, I'm putting my money on the team with the defense, because it's a lot easier for defense to show up week in and week out consistently than it is for an offense that has to score a boatload of points to be that team. And for Florida, I know they've had great defenses the last few years, but they lost 8 defensive starters, including a good bit of first-round talent. So I I think that's going to be too much for them to replace. And then, yeah, they lost Austin Appleby. That's, to me, that's not like they lost their quarterback. Like if Alabama lost Jalen Hurts, or right now Auburn lost to Jarrett Stidham and had to replace him. This is a guy that he was 1A of 1B, C, and D probably. Neither you or I were impressed with him last year. So I don't think they lose a ton on offense. I could see them being better on offense this year, but I think the defense is what's kind of kept them in contention, and I could see that taking a step back. But after those first two, I'm almost like it's anybody's bet. Like I could see Missouri at 3. I could see Tennessee at 3. I could see Will Muschamp having South Carolina come around because they've got a quarterback, and he does eventually get a defense going at every team he coaches. I'm probably going to go Tennessee there. And I don't know why, honestly, because my gut tells me that they're going to take a huge step back with their personnel losses. But I think maybe this year it might be a case where I think, last year between Georgia, Florida, and Tennessee, a lot of those games got, mixed up and sort of decided in the end who won the division. But this year I think there's going to be a huge gap between Florida, Georgia, and everybody else. And sadly, I still think there's going to be a huge gap between East number 1 and West number 1, maybe even down to number 3.